Welcome to Community Barriers to Economic Prosperity, a virtual town hall with Stacey Abrams, a program presented on behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center virtual series. My name is Benouche, and I serve in a voluntary capacity as the Member for Communications and Outreach on the Ismaili Council for the Southeastern United States. The Ismaili Jamatkanas around the world are more than places of worship and spiritual search. These spaces hope to encourage community engagement and broaden our intellectual horizons. September 22nd marks National Voter Registration Day, a nonpartisan civic holiday celebrating our democracy. In 2006, at the International Symposium at the University of Évora in Portugal, His Highness the Aga Khan said that the challenges to democracies were compounded by the rapid growth of cosmopolitan populations as a result of increasing migration. Nations are becoming more pluralist. However, these cosmopolitan social patterns are not matched by what he calls a cosmopolitan ethic. He went on to say that governments alone do not make democracy work. Private initiative is also essential, including the institutions that are collectively described as civil society. We are pleased to have with us today a New York Times best-selling author, an entrepreneur, and a nonprofit CEO. Yes, I am referring to none other than Miss Stacey Abrams. Stacey was the first African-American woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. She's also the first African-American woman and first Georgian, might I add, to deliver a response to the State of the Union. Stacey has founded a number of organizations dedicated to voting rights, to hiring and training young people of color, and tackling social issues at both the state and national levels. Just last year, in 2019, she launched Fair Count to ensure greater accuracy in the 2020 census and greater civic participation and engagement, as well as the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP, which is an initiative to build economic power and equity in the Southern states. Stacey, welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join our virtual program.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Stacey, you are a civic leader who has dedicated your time to strengthening civil society. And as we've spoken about in the past, civil society is the backbone to a strong democracy. I read a recent report published by your organization, SEAP, the Southern Economic Advancement Project. And this was a summary of the 2019 a listening tour with nonprofit leaders across the Southern states. And in this report, there were a number of barriers, community barriers to economic prosperity that were described. For example, civic voice, health, education, affordable childcare, a lack of opportunities for the youth. Stacey, are you able to briefly explain some of these challenges and even give some of your thoughts on how communities can overcome some of these barriers to economic prosperity?
Absolutely. The first step in combating a problem or facing a challenge is understanding the contours of it. And in the South, we know that we face greater risks, not simply in the healthcare crisis that is the pandemic, but in the economic crisis that's been caused by COVID-19. In part because what's happening is that it's exacerbating existing challenges that we already have. Unfortunately, in the South, we have higher rates of vulnerable people. We have higher poverty rates, higher rates of the uninsured. We have more elderly people who face comorbidities or challenges. And unfortunately, we have weaker public systems that are tasked with helping people with needs, especially in times like this. We know that sadly, this is connected to our civic voice. In the South, we tend to have less opportunity to make changes at the very local level. There's an issue called preemption, where if a city like the city of Atlanta or the city of Stockbridge, they attempt to independently address these challenges, such as passing a minimum wage law, or if the city of Birmingham attempted to do something, The problem is that the state legislature can overturn what they do. It's called preemption. They can essentially negate any of the progress that's made. And so civic voice becomes incredibly essential because we need leadership, regardless of partisanship. We need leadership at every level of government that is focused on attacking these issues and addressing these needs. Another issue that unfortunately pervades the South is the lack of health insurance and the lack of access to affordable health care. Most Southern states have failed to expand Medicaid. 9 of the 12 states in the country that have not adopted Medicaid expansion are in the South. That means we not only have some of the worst challenges, we also have the highest numbers of hospitals that close. So even for those who have access to health insurance, if you're in a rural community, your ability to get service may be diminished because of the consequences of not expanding Medicaid. We also have lower rates of paid sick leave, and we have higher rates of poverty that unfortunately skyrocketed in the midst of COVID. But here's the good news. We know that whether it's healthcare access, employment, and particularly employment for young people, if we're thinking about the economic issues and the healthcare issues that we face, we know that there are pathways to addressing it, and that begins by civic engagement. The first step in civic engagement for this year is not simply the election, it's filling out the 2020 census. The census is how we actually allocate funding for some of the challenges we see, and it's how we amass the political power we need to address these in a permanent way. But the other piece is this. We are often in our communities aware of our challenges, but we don't often share our learnings and share a combined mission of solving the problem. And so because our communities, regardless of race, because communities in the South tend to face deeper challenges, like let's say the 4 million Southern households that have experienced food insecurity even before the pandemic, we know that if we've lacked investment and we've lacked wealth, we tend to have a disproportionate burden when there are challenges. But one thing we can do differently is actually work together. And part of the reason I was excited to join you today is that I know the Ismaili community, through the notion of civil society, understands that we are interconnected, that while our demography may be slightly different, our goals and our mission and our intent for civic engagement, but more importantly, for access to opportunity, have to be the same. And that means we should be working together to demand solutions like a federal stimulus package that truly serves all of our communities, better state unemployment systems, better protections for workers, and of course, expansion of Medicaid. If we're willing to do all of the above, then what we face is an opportunity not simply to tackle the challenges we see, but we actually have opportunities to work together to create new opportunities to scale these barriers. And that's why I'm excited to be here with you today.
Stacey, the challenges that you discussed are key to overcome for so many of our communities. The Ismaili Council is the social governing body of the Shia Ismaili community and are engaged in efforts to improve the quality of life of not only our community members, but those amongst whom we live. So I very much appreciate your perspectives, not only on explaining some of these barriers, but also some of the solutions on how communities can really overcome these challenges. Now, Stacey, your organization, SEAP, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, recently released a very timely report, given the current public health crisis that we're all weathering. And in this report, it explains why the South is at a particular risk to economic damage due to COVID-19. Can you explain some of the reasons for this, as well as some considerations that the organization suggests to mitigate this?
Well, as I said earlier, part of the larger scope of challenges that we face in the South have become very much exacerbated by COVID-19. As the region, unfortunately, we've always had higher shares of populations that are at risk, such as elderly residents who require independent living or have assisted living needs. We've always had lower rates of paid sick leave coverage. Often the corporations and businesses in the South do not offer paid sick leave, which means if you get ill, you try to tough it out because you can't afford to take time off. Well, in the midst of a pandemic, that becomes exacerbated because you have a higher risk of infecting others around you. and you actually create more healthcare challenges for yourself if you go untreated. We know that, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we have lower rates of healthcare coverage due in very much strong part due to the failure to expand Medicaid, and that's true across 9 southern states. The only southern states that have expanded Medicaid are Louisiana, Kentucky, and Louisiana and Kentucky. We also know that we have fewer resources to navigate the crisis. When you think about the lack of economic capacity, imagine layering on top of that less time at work, pay cuts. All of those challenges add up. And unfortunately, it is typically in the South that we lack the resources to survive crises like this. And often the support and the solution is to turn to the public safety net. But in the South, we have weak levels of coverage, meaning that if you receive SNAP benefits in the South, it's typically at a much lower rate than you would receive in any other part of the region or any other part of the country, even if the region is economically similar to the South. And that means that we lack the public assistance, the scale and the scope to address what is potentially a $577 billion decline in wages and salaries. And that's just across 7 industries that dominate the South. And again, because we have a lack of state proactive economic policies and preemption, which I mentioned earlier, like minimum wage and paid leave, the states that have the populations most at risk also have the least likelihood of solving the problem. But in election years, we have an opportunity to demand better by electing leaders who actually talk about what we face and offer solutions to the challenges we see. But elections are only one part of the solution. The next part is actually showing up after the election, demanding that they take action on the issues we know that matter. And that means addressing education and closed schools, making sure that while we are thinking about whether to reopen schools, we also think about the number of children across the South that do not have access to broadband and thus are being denied education because they can't join virtually. And when we reopen schools, making sure we open them, recognizing what's been lost. It's making sure that we think about unemployment insurance, the fact that too many in the South have weak uninsurance coverage rates. So how do we raise benefits to cover and minimize unemployment and lost wages? And of course, as I said before, getting access to Medicaid expansion. This sounds like a beaten drum, but I talk about it because not only does it increase the likelihood of access to healthcare, it actually creates jobs. In Georgia alone, Medicaid expansion would cover nearly 500,000 people, but would also create 56,000 new jobs throughout the state of Georgia. Those are good paying jobs that can actually help lift communities, especially communities that are at greatest risk.
Now, Stacey, our community is civically engaged. His Highness, the Aga Khan, is the chairman of the Aga Khan Development Network, which consists of a number of agencies in the areas of education, healthcare, culture, development, all aimed at improving the quality of life of concerned communities, regardless of faith, gender, race, ethnicity. In fact, Islam emphasizes an ethical framework of compassion, sharing, and caring, much like other faiths do. Nationally, the Ismaili community engaged in responsible volunteering, or what is better known as ISERV, within the council consists of a number of volunteers, not only across the Southeast region, but across the country, who are partnering, collaborating with a number of civic organizations, whether that be partnering or collaborating with a number of food banks to help build communities free of hunger, hosting mobile food pantries at our place of worship, the Ismaili Jamatkhana, or even partnering recently with the American Red Cross to encourage blood donations during this crisis. These volunteers devote countless hours to improving our communities. So what I'd like to do, Stacey, at this time for this next segment of this town hall is to invite just a few of our future leaders as they have questions for you and would like to get your thoughts given your experience and your civic leadership.
Absolutely.
To help facilitate this next session of this town hall, I would like to welcome Rosina Merchant, chairperson of the Aga Khan Youth and Sports Board for the Southeastern United States. Rosina has been instrumental in leading many of these service initiatives and civic engagement efforts that I just mentioned in the southern states. Welcome, Rosina.
Thank you, Banush, for the introduction. Stacey, the Aga Khan Youth and Sports Board is so excited to be part of this town hall. We appreciate your time answering some very important questions. First up, we have Sabah Hamani from Fort Mill, South Carolina. Sabah currently is the Aga Khan Youth Sports Board District Lead for Spartanburg, South Carolina. She is a senior at the University of South Carolina, pursuing a degree in public health, and works as an academic peer consultant. Sabah, your question, please.
Ms. Abrams, even though the law requires everyone to participate in the census, can you explain why it is so important to be counted in the 2020 census?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. We know that the census is one of the functions that was actually mentioned in the Constitution. And we've had a census every 10 years since 1790. The census is not simply a count. It is an account. It is not simply a count. It is an account of everyone we have in this country. And so the first thing to understand is that the census is not a enumeration of citizenship. It's an enumeration of anyone in the country as of April 1st of the census year. But what that means is that it tells us the story of who we are, but it also serves as a predictor of what we're going to need. And the way I like to think about the census is this. It gives us two forms of power. One is economic power and the other is political power. The economic power is that based on who is here and what they need, $1.5 trillion is allocated every single year across 316 federal programs. Many people don't realize how much of their lives are affected, but the roads and bridges you drive on, if they don't have an accurate count of who's in your community, your roads, your bridges may not be updated. But it also determines your schools, how many kids are shoved into a classroom. If you went to a school where you had trailers in the back, part of that is because there was an undercount and they never caught up. But it also pays for Pell Grants. When students go to college, Pell Grants are allocated based on the estimated population that is gathered from the census. And so some students miss out because we don't have adequate resources because of an inaccurate count. And the reason it matters so much is that the count we do in 2020 is the count that gets used all the way through 2030. They'll update it a little bit based on actuarial data, but they're never going to do the denominator again. Once that number is set, it's set. And so if you miss out on your share of those resources, you've missed out for 10 years. And in the midst of COVID-19, when we think about recovery, all of the dollars that will be allocated to pay for healthcare and new jobs and new access, all of those dollars are going to come through the census. And so if there are communities that are not included, they will be left out and they will not receive their resources. The second part is the political power part. So I talked about the economic power. Political power is also an incredible part of the census. We all talk about gerrymandering at the congressional level because the census apportions the 435 congressional leaders that we have, meaning that if a state gets larger, they get more people, they get more representation. But that means the state loses representation because they're only ever going to be 435. But the other part is that the lines that are drawn to determine who represents you, who you get to vote for, whether it's at the federal level, at the state level, even at the school board and city council level, those numbers are determined now. And I like to think about it as a room. If you get to go into a room with people who share your values, who believe in access to education and to healthcare, who believe in civic engagement, or you can be put in a room with people who think it's every person for themselves, they don't care what happens to anybody else. Most of us want to be in a room with people who share our values. Well, if we don't have an accurate count, those of us who have those values can be split up and put inside rooms where our voices don't get heard as much. I would rather be put in a room with people who share my voice so we can be amplified and be louder. And the only way to be put in the right room is if we participate in the census. So when those political districts are drawn, they see us and our voices are heard. And so I like to say we can win an election, but if we want to win the future, we have to complete the census.
Thank you, Stacey. Next, we have Salik Sohani from Atlanta, Georgia. Salik is a graduate of New York University and is an incoming Peace Corps volunteer. Salik, your question, please.
Hi, Stacey. My question is on voting. Too often, citizens do not take the time to vote. In a recent article by you in the New York Times, you stated, and I quote, "Voting is a first step in a long and complex process, tedious but vital." Can you please tell us what you mean by that?
People don't vote for a variety of reasons. Some do not vote because they simply do not wish to do so. They do not wish to be engaged. But there's another cohort of people who don't vote because they're not permitted to. They want to engage, but they face various issues of voter suppression, whether it's whether they can register and stay on the rolls, whether they can access a ballot, and whether their ballot gets counted. But then you have a third group that are usually dismissed as apathetic, but these are communities who have tried voting but have not seen their lives change. They've lived through multiple generations of poverty. They've seen ongoing police brutality, and they simply do not see the benefit in voting. And so when I said that, what I wanted to speak to are all three groups. There are those who, despite everything, really do not believe that it's worth being engaged. And I get it. I don't understand it, but I get it. But for the other two groups, part of our responsibility is to acknowledge that there are legitimate barriers that people face, and we cannot fix those barriers if we don't talk about them and work to dismantle them. But the other part is recognizing that there is no magic pill in voting. And I get very disturbed when I hear people describe voting as this panacea that solves everything. It doesn't. It's a process. And the reason I liken it to a process, I think about it like a disease. If we have a disease of racism, the disease of environmental injustice, the disease of economic inequity, the disease of racial bias, we can't expect a magic pill to solve it. But if we think about it like a cancer that has to be treated with radiation and chemotherapy, we know that that's going to take time and that you don't get to do it once and walk away. And sometimes the treatment hurts worse than the disease may. But we know that if we keep the process going, if we keep taking the treatment, progress is made and eventually solutions are found. My mission is to remind people that it has been a very long time that we have had these challenges, but we have not been working on it all this time. You know, this is a country that's been around for 240 years, but for the first 100 years of our existence, slavery was not just acceptable, it was inculcated into our very founding documents. Racism and sexism and xenophobia have been a part of who we are, but every single generation we do better, in part because people vote and then vote again and then vote again and vote again. Because what you're doing is you're voting out those people who've proven they cannot be trusted, and you're helping to vote in those who can make progress. And I would rather be a part of the process because, as I've heard said, and I like to repeat, if we are not at the table, we are likely on the menu.
Thank you, Stacey. Next, we have Mona Shaban from Nashville, Tennessee. Mona is a senior at Emory University studying psychology and currently serves as our Southeast iServe Regional Director of Marketing and Data Analysis. Mona, your question, please.
The way society is evolving, especially over the last several months, how can I equip myself today with the skills and tools to be an effective leader?
Thank you. Well, I would say that all of you are very much on your way, because the first step of leadership is understanding the scale of the challenges you face. Part of leadership is not simply having a plan to attack, it's having the ability to explain to others why there is a problem and that the problem isn't just them. Voter suppression is an issue I talk about a lot. I talk about the census a lot. And in both, part of my responsibility is demystifying it so that people feel that they are a part of the solution. But you can't be a part of the solution if you don't know what the problem is. So the first step of leadership is being able to explain the problem. The second step is being able to explain why it's a problem. And that's what's so critical about the work that you all do, the work that I try to do. We can't just say we need to vote. We have to be able to explain how voting is connected to the change we need to see. That if we want better education, if we want access to healthcare, if we want an environment that is around for the next 100 years, we have to explain why it's a challenge if these things aren't done. And then the third is, how do you solve it? It's giving people the tools that you help them learn how to use. But true leadership is not using the tool yourself. It's making sure that those you work with can use the tools themselves. And that's being able to speak up. So educating others about what they need. It's about standing up, meaning showing up in places where people are making those decisions and demanding that they do what they need to do. And then if necessary, it's by showing out. And that means protesting, sometimes protesting in the streets, but often it's protesting by running for those offices yourself so that you can be the decision maker. Leadership has to see the entire scope of the problem and recognize that you need to find a space where you fit in, but that you also look for places for others to find themselves. The truest leadership is when people believe that they were in charge all along.
Thank you. And finally, we have Saloni Merchant, all the way from Auburn, Alabama. Saloni is a junior at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, pursuing a degree in economics and international business. Your question, Saloni.
Hello, Ms. Abrams.
Hi.
My question to you is, our generation strives to excel in education, and under the guidance of our spiritual leader, or Imam, His Highness the Aga Khan, we also try to foster self-realization through the giving of oneself for the common good. Based on your life experiences and the path you have chosen to give back to society, what advice would you give to today's generation?
I am a practicing Christian, and I was raised by my parents who, when I was 15, decided they didn't decide, they were called into the ministry. They became United Methodist ministers. And so I grew up living with my imams and that's a very different way of growing up. But what it did was help me really locate why I do the work that I do and why it matters so much to me. And I encourage every young person to be as ambitious as you can about what change you want to see. So often we are told to edit our ambitions, that that's too big. You can't possibly solve this problem, that you can do something, but you can't do enough, that change is not likely. And so my first bit of advice is be as ambitious as you can be. I believe that poverty is immoral. I believe it is economically inefficient, and I believe it's solvable. And so I've committed myself to work that will eradicate poverty. And most people will tell you, oh, that you can't do that. But for me, the ambition has to be so large that my work can't stop. So first, have grand ambitions and don't edit it. 2, don't go alone. So often we see leaders who become isolated because they believe they're the only person who understands the problem. They're the only person who can get it done. That's never true. I'm the second of 6 children. I grew up with a committee. And so what I understood very early on is partnership matters. Having someone who can test your thoughts against, someone who can give you a better idea than the one you had, someone who can get into good trouble with you, to use John Lewis's phrase. Having a partner doing it with others makes you stronger. It doesn't weaken you, and it doesn't make you less of a leader. And sometimes when you're young, there's a sense that if I can get the credit, then I can get more done. And I would say I'd rather have 50% of something than 100% of nothing. And then the third is that allow yourself to fail. Ambition is extraordinary and partnerships are necessary, but so is not getting things done and learning how to manage in that space. If what we wanted to do was absolutely accomplishable, it would have been done before. What I cling to is the fact that for me, the trying matters. And when I don't get it completely done, when I don't become governor, when I don't become this, that it's not about me not being enough. I may not have gotten that thing done, but I can learn from that moment. I can learn new lessons. I can better how I approach it. But more than anything, I can remind myself that I am not a failure. I may not have succeeded in this moment, but I am only a failure if I allow it to stop me from meeting my ambition and getting it done.
Thank you so much, Stacey. And thank you, Saloni, for that question. Stacey, on behalf of the Aga Khan Youth and Sports Board, I would like to thank you so much for your time today. I would now like to hand it over back to Benush.
Thank you, Rosina, and to our future leaders for your dedication and your commitment to improving our communities. And thank you, Stacey, for sharing your time, sharing your perspectives with us today, and empowering our country's future leaders. And Stacey, we would love to host you next time, hopefully in person. That's the Atlanta Ismaili Jamatkhana, and invite our future leaders not only from across our region, the Southeast region, but from across the country. On behalf of
honor.
Absolutely, thank you. On behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, thank you for joining.